The trouble began on an early spring morning when the sun was barely lifting itself over the rooftops, and the neighborhood still carried that quiet, sleepy stillness that only lasts a few minutes before the day begins to stir. I had stepped outside with a cup of coffee in hand, expecting nothing more than a quick walk around my backyard before heading to work, but instead I froze mid-step, nearly dropping the mug as my eyes locked onto a scene that didn't make sense at first glance. A brand new fence segment stood at the far end of my yard, fresh wood, bright metal posts, and a straight line that cut directly into the property I had cared for over a decade. At first I wondered if I was simply misremembering where the boundary ended, but my father had been a military civil engineer, and I had walked these edges with him countless times growing up. They were burned into my memory with almost surgical precision. The fence was wrong, very wrong. I walked slowly across the yard, each step heavy with disbelief as I approached the new construction. The fresh dirt around the posts told me it had been installed recently, possibly during the night or early morning hours. The boards stood confidently where they absolutely did not belong, shifting my land by what looked like nearly 12 feet. The audacity alone made my stomach twist, but the sinking feeling came when I noticed something else. Small orange flags stuck in the grass on my side of the fence, as if someone had carefully marked out the new boundary and built accordingly. It was deliberate, methodical, and done behind my back. I followed the fence line until I reached the open area that connected to my neighbor's yard, Karen's yard. Karen, the woman who had moved in 2 years earlier and made complaints about everything from my lawn height to the color of my shutters, the kind of person who believed HOA rules were weapons to be wielded, like personal artillery, rather than guidelines meant to keep a community functioning. She was the type who saw property lines not as legal boundaries, but as suggestions she could adjust whenever it benefited her. It didn't take long before she emerged from her porch, arms crossed, a smug expression plastered across her face, radiating the kind of confidence only an entitled neighbor could muster. Though she didn't speak, her posture said everything. The fence was staying, she believed it was her right, and she had no plans to move it back. I knew, right in that moment, that this wasn't a misunderstanding but a carefully planned encroachment, executed under the assumption that I wouldn't fight back or wouldn't have the proof to challenge her. But she was wrong, so very wrong. Still stunned, I walked the length of the fence again, mentally tracing the original boundary. My father's voice echoed in my mind, reminding me of the nights we spent reviewing the old military-grade survey maps he kept as mementos from his years working on federal installations. Those maps were unfailingly precise, made with technology that far surpassed civilian residential surveying equipment. I still had them stored in a weatherproof case inside my attic, documents stamped and sealed with federal certification. If this turned into a fight, I had the strongest proof imaginable. But I also knew that the HOA had a long and ugly history of siding with whatever benefited them or their favorite members. And unfortunately, Karen had spent nearly every HOA event volunteering, gossiping, and inserting herself into board discussions, slowly becoming one of their unofficial allies. She was the kind of neighbor who slipped donations into board members' favorite charity boxes or brought elaborate homemade desserts to every meeting, ensuring she was always seen as helpful, supportive, and therefore above reproach whenever complaints arose. If she had built this fence illegally, she surely believed the HOA would protect her, and knowing them, she was probably right, at least at first. As the morning unfolded, I tried reaching out to the HOA, only to be met with cold indifference, long silences, and the unsettling feeling that they already knew about the fence. One board member even hinted that property lines shift naturally over time, an idea so absurd I almost laughed. Property lines do not shift, only people shift them, and in this case, that person was Karen. By noon, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers, people passing by pretending not to stare while very clearly staring. Some shook their heads sympathetically, while others seemed amused by the drama, but none were brave enough to come forward. It was as if everyone sensed a storm was brewing and wanted safe distance before it broke. Inside my house, I dug through old storage boxes until I found the heavy binder containing the survey maps my father had drafted decades ago. The edges were still crisp, the seals still sharp, the measurements ridiculously exact. When he made them, he didn't just measure my property, he measured the entire block, mapping out every inch with the precision of a military engineer tasked with designing a base. These maps did not just hold legal weight, they held authoritative accuracy few civilian documents could challenge. As I carefully spread them across my table, the full scale of the encroachment became undeniable. Karen hadn't stolen a foot or two, she had taken nearly 12 feet across the entire stretch of the yard, amounting to hundreds of square feet of property. It was theft, plain and simple, executed under the guise of neighborly ambiguity. And worse, the HOA seemed perfectly willing to accept her reinterpretation of the line. Standing there, I felt the first flicker of something stronger than anger determination. Karen and the HOA had made a calculated move, assuming I would be too intimidated or too unprepared to challenge them. They assumed I would roll over, accept the fence, and move on. But they didn't know who my father was, what he had taught me, or what documents I still had tucked away like hidden weapons waiting for the right moment to surface. The decision crystallized then. I would fight, not with shouting matches or petty retaliation, but with facts, documents, and the kind of evidence that even the most biased HOA board couldn't deny. I gathered the maps, the original deed, the county plat survey, and every piece of documentation proving the legitimate boundaries. I prepared a packet that could withstand legal scrutiny and bureaucratic nonsense. But even as I organized everything, I knew presenting it to the HOA wouldn't be enough, not when they were emotionally invested in protecting Karen. I would need someone above them, someone with legal authority and no patience for neighborhood politics. A state property inspector. The thought alone sent a chill of anticipation through me, because state inspectors don't play games. They don't bend rules. They don't care who brought cookies to board meetings. They care about legal boundaries, violations, and fines. Big fines. And from the looks of the situation, Karen and the HOA were in for a very rude awakening. As the day came to an end, I stood once more in my yard, staring at the newly erected fence. It looked sturdy, proud even, as if it believed it truly belonged there. But I knew it was temporary, a monument to Karen's arrogance that would soon be dismantled piece by piece. What she thought was a quiet victory was only the beginning of a much larger battle, one she had unknowingly triggered by pushing her luck too far. I headed back inside, gripping the binder of maps like a weapon as the sky darkened overhead. The first move belonged to Karen, but the next one would be mine, and it would hit harder than she ever expected. As night settled and the neighborhood lights flickered on, I felt a shift in the air, the silent promise of the conflict ahead. The next morning arrived with an uneasy stillness, the kind that settles right before a storm. Even though the sky remained clear and deceptively calm, I woke before sunrise, unable to shake the restless anticipation that had built overnight. Today was the day I would set things in motion. The binder containing the military-grade survey maps lay on my dining table, its weight somehow heavier than before, as if fully aware of the power it held. I brewed coffee, not because I needed the caffeine, but because the ritual grounded me, steadied the emotions swirling beneath the surface. Anger, determination, and something else, too, confidence. For the first time since discovering the fence, I felt a quiet sense of control returning, a feeling that the ground Karen had attempted to steal was already slipping from her grasp. With the morning calm as my companion, I reviewed my documents one final time, ensuring every measurement, every seal, every line was accurate and ready to withstand scrutiny. The military maps were flawless, but I also included the county plat survey, my property deed, previous HOA records, and a personal letter summarizing the timeline of events. I wanted everything to look organized, unshakable, authoritative. Karen had emotion and entitlement on her side. I had precision and legal force. And, as the saying goes, facts don't care about feelings, especially not hers. Once my packet was assembled, I filed an official request with the state property inspector's office. This wasn't the kind of complaint the county handled. The magnitude of land manipulation and the HOA's involvement pushed it into the realm of state jurisdiction. Their automated system acknowledged my submission, and within minutes, I received confirmation that my case had been assigned to an inspector. That alone was a victory. State inspectors didn't pick up every residential complaint, only the ones with serious legal weight. That meant the moment they saw my documents, they knew something was very, very wrong. The sense of satisfaction warmed me as I printed the appointment confirmation. Yet I knew I couldn't rely solely on the state to handle everything. HOAs often tried to intervene before higher authorities could take action, manipulating outcomes and altering records to defend themselves. Karen, especially, would scramble to protect her fabricated boundary. So, even before I received the appointment date, I walked directly to the HOA office, a small building near the community entrance designed to look welcoming, but decorated with pretentious granite counters and framed rules covering every wall. Inside, I found 3 board members sitting around a table cluttered with paperwork, snacks, and a sense of undeserved self-importance. They glanced up at me with the same rehearsed politeness that always coated their meetings, thin as paper and just as easy to tear through. Though they didn't speak, their eyes flickered with something between annoyance and expectation, as if they already knew why I had come and were prepared to dismiss me before I opened my mouth. I handed them a printed packet summarizing my dispute and watched their expressions shift as they realized I wasn't making an emotional plea, I was presenting evidence. It was subtle, but I saw it. A twitch in the president's jaw, a stiffening in the treasurer's shoulders, a tiny widening of the secretary's eyes as she scanned the military seals on the survey maps. These weren't amateur sketches. These were authoritative documents created with equipment they had no counter-argument against. But despite their discomfort, the president pushed the papers aside with far less care than they deserved, leaning forward with the faux confidence of someone who believes their position grants them power over truth itself. He insisted the fence was likely fine, that property boundaries were often misunderstood, and that they had no reason to question a long-standing resident like Karen. Long-standing? She had lived here for 2 years. I had lived here for 12. But the HOA was never about fairness. It was about favoritism. Even so, their confidence seemed thinner now. They were trying to sound authoritative, but it was clear they didn't understand the scale of what they were challenging. Military survey maps were not suggestions, they were federal-level documentation. Still, I didn't argue. I simply informed them that a state inspector had already been assigned to investigate the boundary dispute. That single sentence dropped into the room like a grenade with the pin pulled. The board members froze. The president lost his practiced composure. The secretary's pen slipped from her fingers. The treasurer's face drained of color. HOAs thrive on control, but state inspectors operate on a level that strips them of any power. Any violation the inspector found wouldn't result in a warning or a friendly suggestion. It would result in fines, possible legal action, and a permanent stain on the HOA's record with the state housing authority. Without waiting for them to recover, I collected my papers and left the office, feeling their panicked stares follow me out the door. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the community pathways. As I walked home, I noticed neighbors beginning their morning routines, joggers, dog walkers, people tending gardens. They all pretended not to notice me, but their glances betrayed curiosity. Rumors traveled fast here, and the newly built fence had already become the talk of the neighborhood. But none of them knew what was coming next, not even Karen. When I returned home, Karen was standing near the fence, tapping her foot with exaggerated impatience, as if waiting for me. She walked the fence line again and again, examining each post like she was inspecting her greatest achievement. I watched her from my window, noting the way she admired her work with smug satisfaction. She truly believed she had manipulated the boundary successfully, solidifying a permanent gain at my expense. Little did she know the foundation beneath her stolen property was already cracking. 2 hours later, I received the email that sealed her fate. The state inspector scheduled a site visit for Friday morning. That was 3 days from now. 3 days for Karen and the HOA to stew in uncertainty. 3 days for their fabricated confidence to crumble. 3 days until reality arrived at their doorstep, wearing an official badge and carrying authority they could not undermine. But I wasn't finished yet. If Karen and the HOA planned to resist the inspection, they might try sabotaging evidence or altering documentation. I needed everything airtight. So I went outside and began photographing the entire boundary line from multiple angles, ensuring nothing changed without me noticing. I took time-stamped photos of the fence, the ground, the surrounding trees, even small markers that had been on my property for years. I wanted every detail preserved. While taking photos, I noticed something unusual. A set of boot prints near the far corner of the new fence, deep in the soil, far larger than Karen's. Someone else had been helping her, likely a contractor, but the strange thing was that the prints overlapped several freshly crushed grass patches I knew weren't mine. It meant someone had walked through my yard without permission. Karen hadn't just moved the fence, she had trespassed. And depending on how the inspector viewed it, that could turn the situation criminal. The weight of everything settled heavier now. This wasn't just petty entitlement. This was calculated theft. I continued documenting everything until afternoon, making sure no detail went unnoticed. When I finally stepped back inside, Exhaustion tugged at my limbs, but adrenaline kept me alert. As the day drew on, I prepared for every possible outcome. I created digital backups of the survey maps. I saved photos to cloud storage. I organized a binder specifically for the inspector. That night, while most of the neighborhood fell into its peaceful nightly routine, lights flicking off one by one, I caught a glimpse of something unusual from my living room window. Karen stood by the fence with a flashlight, checking every board, pacing nervously. She must have heard about the inspector appointment, maybe from the HOA, maybe from the panicked board members trying to salvage their mistake. Either way, Karen was rattled, and her fear only fueled my determination. She stopped at one post, kneeling down, pressing her hands into the dirt as if checking stability. Then she paced again. She was worried. Good. She should be. She had spent years treating HOA rules like weapons, wielding them to intimidate neighbors, manipulating board members, and playing victim whenever she didn't get her way. But this time, she had crossed a boundary in more ways than one. And now, a force far greater than any homeowners association was stepping in. As midnight approached, I stood alone in my kitchen, staring at the binder one last time, the weight of everything both heavy and strangely empowering. The war Karen started was about to escalate, and the next chapter of this fight would begin with the arrival of a state inspector, whose authority could dismantle her lies and possibly the entire HOA along with them. The storm was coming. The days leading up to the inspector's arrival moved with a strange tension, as if the entire neighborhood was collectively holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. From the outside, everything looked quiet and ordinary: families, walking dogs, sprinklers ticking across freshly trimmed lawns, cars humming down the main road. But beneath that surface was an undercurrent of unease that stretched from my yard all the way to the HOA office. Every morning I awoke feeling the weight of anticipation pressing against my chest, and every evening I found myself pacing near the fence line, double-checking that nothing had changed overnight. It felt like living inside a pressure chamber, and Friday, the day everything would unfold, loomed over me like a countdown clock I couldn't slow. On Wednesday, 2 days before the inspection, I was outside adjusting my sprinkler system when I noticed Karen standing near her back porch, speaking in a low, frantic tone to someone on the phone. She kept glancing toward the fence, her movements sharp, restless, and nothing like the smug confidence she had displayed earlier that week. She paced with short, clipped steps, gesturing wildly with her free hand as if arguing with whoever was on the other end. Her voice was too faint to hear the specifics, but a few words drifted across the yard: boundary, inspection, fine, and not my fault. The phrase "not my fault" repeated several times, almost desperately, and each repetition confirmed what I had suspected from the moment I contacted the state. Karen was losing her grip on the narrative she had tried to force into reality. It wasn't just a fence to her anymore. It was the beginning of something much bigger, something she couldn't manipulate or charm or intimidate her way out of. Later that afternoon, as I returned from the mailbox, I saw a black SUV parked near the HOA building, the kind of vehicle driven by someone with authority. The sight alone sent a ripple through the neighborhood. People paused mid-walk, turned their heads, whispered among themselves. The HOA president hurried outside in a poorly disguised attempt to appear calm, but instead looked like a man hoping to intercept trouble before it reached him. The SUV door opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out, carrying a clipboard and wearing a badge that gleamed under the sunlight. For a moment, my breath caught. Could the inspector have arrived early? But as he spoke to the president, it became clear he was someone else. A county compliance officer responding to a separate complaint, most likely something unrelated to my situation. Still, watching the HOA president nervously attempt to explain whatever issue had drawn the officer here only strengthened my resolve. If a county officer alone caused this much panic, the HOA had no idea how severe things would get when the state arrived. By Thursday, the quiet anxiety had grown into something sharper. Neighbors began lingering outside more frequently, pretending to tend to their gardens or check their mail while sneaking glances at the fence. I overheard small bursts of conversation, snippets of speculation, whispers about property disputes, and one comment claiming Karen was finally getting called out for her behavior. It became clear that this wasn't the first time she'd manipulated the HOA or pushed boundaries, only the first time someone fought back with evidence, stronger than gossip. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, I noticed movement near the fence again. But it wasn't Karen this time. It was two men wearing matching shirts that belonged to a local fencing company. They moved quickly, inspecting the posts, pressing their hands against the boards, tightening bolts, and making small adjustments. Panic surged through me. At first I thought they might be trying to alter the fence before the inspection, perhaps shifting it even further onto my property or removing certain signs of tampering. But as I watched more closely, their movements seemed rushed and sloppy, not precise or strategic. It looked less like a planned sabotage and more like desperate damage control. Karen must have hired them last minute, trying to reinforce the fence so it appeared professionally installed rather than the rushed, poorly measured construction it truly was. But the very act of having workers touch the fence before an official boundary inspection showed how frantic she'd become. And in a way, it helped me. Any sign of recent interference would undermine her claim that the fence had always been in that location. I documented everything with photographs from my upstairs window, zooming in as the workers adjusted posts and replaced certain boards. One man even dug near the base of a corner post, possibly trying to hide inconsistencies in depth or placement. Their work continued for nearly an hour before they packed up and left, leaving the fence looking newer, but also suspiciously altered. I saved every photo, every time-stamped video clip, knowing the inspector would want details like these. That night, sleep came slowly. My mind cycled through possibilities. What if the inspector dismissed the maps? What if the HOA tried to interfere directly? What if Karen fabricated a story convincing enough to delay or derail the investigation? But each time doubt tried to creep in, I reminded myself of the facts. My father's survey maps were federal grade, stamped, sealed, precise to within inches. The fence was undeniably constructed well past the legal boundary, and the state inspector had no relationship with Karen, no loyalty to the HOA, no reason to bend rules for anyone. The truth was on my side. When Friday morning finally arrived, I woke before the alarm, jolted upright by a rush of adrenaline. The air felt heavy, as if even the weather anticipated confrontation. Clouds gathered overhead, their dull gray tones giving the neighborhood an almost cinematic tension. I brewed coffee, but barely touched it, too focused on preparing for what was ahead. I placed the binder of documents on the dining table, ensuring everything was in place. The maps, the deed, the plat survey, the photos, the timeline, and copies of emails with the HOA. At exactly 9:12 a.m., a white state vehicle turned onto my street. The moment the inspector's car appeared, several neighbors subtly drifted out of their homes, watering plants, sweeping driveways, pretending to go for walks. There was no hiding the spectacle now. Everyone wanted to witness whatever was about to unfold. The inspector stepped out of the car, a tall man with silver hair, steady eyes, and a demeanor that radiated quiet authority. He wore a state-issued jacket and carried a thick case of measuring tools, digital devices, and documentation equipment. Everything about him conveyed professionalism and impartiality. He didn't look around with curiosity or socialize, he assessed. He observed. He processed. As he approached my driveway, I greeted him and handed him the binder without hesitation. He opened it immediately, scanning the military survey maps with an expression that remained carefully neutral, but his eyes sharpened with interest. He asked a few procedural questions, clear, concise, factual, and then proceeded directly toward the fence. Karen must have been watching from inside her house, because the moment the inspector reached the boundary line, she burst from her back door, moving far too quickly to be casual. She approached with a strained smile plastered across her face, the kind of expression worn by someone trying to disguise panic as friendliness. But the inspector didn't humor her. He remained strictly professional, maintaining distance, acknowledging her presence, but focusing entirely on the measurements and documentation before him. What followed felt like watching a slow-motion collision. The inspector used GPS-based surveying equipment, laser distance meters, and reference markers embedded in the neighborhood's development plans. He took measurements from 3 different angles, cross-checked them, recalculated them, and compared the results with the military maps and original county records. With each measurement, his expression tightened slightly, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that something was unquestionably wrong. Karen, meanwhile, began inventing explanations, excuses, and claims about the fence being historic or always in that location, but the inspector barely acknowledged her. Facts don't bend for voices. When his final measurement aligned exactly with my father's survey maps, he let out a slow exhale, the kind that signaled a conclusion had been reached. He didn't announce it dramatically or raise his voice. He simply closed his equipment case, wrote something on his clipboard, and informed Karen in a firm, unshakable tone that the fence was built far beyond her legal property line by nearly 12 feet. The exact number I had estimated. The color drained from Karen's face so fast, it was almost shocking, her shoulders slumping as the weight of her actions crashed down on her. But the inspector wasn't finished. He informed her that due to the scale of the encroachment, the involvement of the HOA, and the unauthorized construction on another person's land, the situation would be escalated for legal review. And as he spoke those words, another shift happened, one far more significant. He turned toward the HOA president, who had just arrived, red-faced and breathless, rushing down the sidewalk. The inspector's eyes hardened. The HOA, he said, had knowingly allowed a boundary violation to occur despite having access to the original community maps and development blueprints. That itself was grounds for a separate investigation. The board president stammered, tried to deflect, attempted to blame miscommunication, but his excuses crumbled as quickly as Karen's confidence had earlier. The inspector informed him that the HOA would be required to present their internal records, meeting notes, and approvals for review. And depending on what they found, the board could face fines, mandatory restructuring, or even temporary shutdown. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a surge of victorious disbelief. This wasn't just validation, this was accountability. And as the inspector packed his tools and prepared the official notice, the neighborhood watched in stunned silence. Everything had shifted. Everything had begun. But the fallout? That was still ahead. The morning after the HOA's so-called mediation felt heavier than the others, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting to see what would erupt next. And I knew that whatever happened now would shape the entire war ahead. The situation, once a simple boundary dispute, had evolved into something far more calculated and sinister. Because now it wasn't just about a fence or a Karen neighbor grabbing land. It had become a coordinated attempt by an HOA board to weaponize authority against a single homeowner who dared challenge them. I could feel that shift in every cold glance from passing residents, and in the eerie silence dripping from the HOA group emails that usually buzzed nonstop. It was clear that Karen had polarized the neighborhood, and whether by manipulation or sheer volume of lies, she had convinced many that I was the aggressor, the troublemaker, the outsider trying to disrupt their perfect little bubble. The fence stood defiantly in the wrong place, a 12-foot symbol of arrogance and entitlement, and every morning I could see Karen near it, pretending to trim imaginary vines or measure imaginary lines, all while glaring into my yard as if expecting me to crumble under her staged confidence. But the truth was that she had no idea how deeply I had already dug into the records, or how devastating the evidence in my possession truly was. Still, I knew that evidence alone was not enough if the HOA was willing to distort rules and even fabricate claims, so I needed to be strategic, patient, and far more meticulous than they expected. I spent the next hours analyzing the HOA's bylaws, cross-referencing survey codes, and studying the county's property statutes, the same way my father had taught me when he used to prepare for military infrastructure projects that demanded zero tolerance for error. The old survey map, with its precise grid points and coordinates traced by my father's steady engineer hand, lay open across my dining table like a weapon waiting to be unsheathed. Every contour line, every annotation, every placement of stakes decades ago aligned perfectly with the county records I had pulled. There was not even a fraction of ambiguity. My property line was indisputable, and Karen's encroachment was blatant, yet the HOA's false bravado came from assuming I would never escalate beyond them, that I would accept their arbitrary decisions as final. They didn't realize I had already filed a digital request for an emergency site inspection with the State Land Boundary Office. And although I had received no response yet, I suspected that the silence only meant they were preparing something thorough. Just before noon, I noticed movement outside. Karen was speaking with two HOA board members near the fence, pointing aggressively toward my house while shaking her head in exaggerated disbelief. One board member scribbled notes as if compiling a list of fabricated violations, while the other examined the fence line with fake expertise, nodding as though the fraudulent structure was some brilliant architectural marvel instead of a bold land grab. From inside my window, I watched all three of them weaving a narrative together, one that likely painted me as unstable or confrontational, a tactic that was all too common in HOA disputes. Part of me wanted to storm out and demand to know what they were plotting, but experience had taught me that confronting people determined to twist reality only fed their story. The better move was to document everything. So I quietly filmed them from inside, capturing their measurements, gestures, and the part where Karen dramatically paced out her imaginary property line to the wrong coordinates, pantomiming confidence that was based entirely on delusion. As the day passed, I continued preparing every possible document the state inspector might request. Emails, timestamps, photos, copies of the bylaws, survey attachments, and screenshots of Karen's bizarre late-night posts on the neighborhood app ranting about me, moving markers in the dark. When evening approached, exhaustion weighed heavily from constantly bracing for whatever the HOA would fire next. I stepped outside to get fresh air, only to find a bright orange violation notice taped aggressively to my mailbox. The letter accused me of tampering with HOA-controlled common boundary structures, which was both false and infuriating. There was no such category in the entire rulebook. They had literally invented a rule overnight. The intention was obvious: stack enough violations to justify a forced compliance hearing, then use that hearing to pressure me to back down. Karen's influence was metastasizing through the HOA like a virus. I peeled off the notice, scanned it with my phone, and added it to the growing digital folder, titled HOA Fabricated Evidence. I knew it would be invaluable later, but even as I fought this bureaucratic battle, I couldn't help feeling the psychological weight of living under constant surveillance and hostility. Every step outside felt monitored, every movement judged. Karen even installed a cheap solar-powered camera pointing directly at my yard, claiming it was for wildlife observation, even though it faced only my fence. The level of obsession was becoming disturbing, yet this escalation only fueled my determination. People who resort to dirty tactics rarely expect their target to stay calm, meticulous, and patient. Late that night, while I continued reviewing county case archives online, my inbox pinged. It was a notification from the state's boundary inspection office. My pulse quickened as I opened it, expecting perhaps a request for more documents or a notice of delay. But instead, the message simply stated that an inspector had reviewed my initial submission and scheduled an unannounced site evaluation within the next 72 hours. The email carefully emphasized that I was to maintain the property as is, and not modify any dispute-related structures until after the evaluation. The relief that washed over me was overwhelming. Someone with actual authority was about to intervene, someone who had no personal ties to Karen or the HOA board, someone who would see the land through the cold precision of legal boundaries, not through politics or neighborhood favoritism. I couldn't sleep that night, not from anxiety, but from a restless anticipation that felt like the final moments before a chess game's decisive strike. I sat in the dark living room, replaying the entire ordeal in my mind, each moment of manipulation, each act of Karen's entitlement, each slapdash attempt by the HOA to rewrite reality. I pictured the inspector scanning the area with measuring equipment, marking the true coordinates, tracing the real edges of the property line, watching Karen's confidence crumble as objective evidence replaced her fantasies. And I pictured the HOA board, stripped of their false authority, forced to acknowledge that they had backed a liar. But even as those thoughts simmered, I reminded myself that people like Karen rarely concede gracefully. If anything, the upcoming inspection might push her into a full-blown spiral. As the sun began to rise, I realized another unavoidable truth. The moment the inspector arrived would not just expose the lies, it would unravel the entire power structure that Karen had built in the neighborhood. The HOA board had tied their credibility to her claims, and once those claims collapsed, the fallout would be massive, messy, and irreversible. Yet I also felt a deep sense of vindication beginning to form. Not out of pettiness, but out of knowing that justice often moves slowly, yet precisely. And when it finally strikes, it leaves no room for illusions. The stage was set, the evidence prepared, and all that remained was the confrontation that would either end the conflict or ignite an even larger one. And as the first light crept across the disputed fence line, marking every inch of stolen land in pale dawn, I knew without question that the moment of reckoning was only hours away, setting the tone for the explosive events that would unfold in the next chapter. The morning the inspector arrived began with an eerie stillness that settled over the neighborhood like a warning, as if every house sensed a shift in the balance of power that was about to unfold. And while I had spent days preparing for this moment, nothing could truly brace me for the emotional weight of finally confronting the lies, manipulations, and coordinated harassment that had built up like a storm front across my property line. I noticed the state vehicle even before it pulled into my driveway, the unmistakable white SUV with the emblem on the door glinting beneath the rising sun, and instantly I felt a sharp breath of relief, mixed with an undercurrent of anxiety, knowing that this was the first authoritative figure to step into a situation that had spiraled out of control. The inspector, dressed in a field vest, carrying both a tablet and a rugged laser measuring system, stepped out with an air of calm professionalism that contrasted violently with the chaos Karen and the HOA had created for weeks. As he surveyed the yard, his measured movements and analytical gaze made it obvious he intended to examine every inch with absolute precision, and for the first time, I felt the presence of someone who could not be manipulated by gossip or bullied by self-appointed neighborhood tyrants. Karen must have been watching from her window, because within minutes she stormed out of her house with the HOA president and another board member trailing behind her, their expressions shifting from feigned confidence to poorly concealed worry as they realized the state wasn't there to take their word for anything. The inspector ignored their frantic attempts to control the narrative and proceeded methodically, starting at the official county markers located near the sidewalk, logging coordinates with pinpoint accuracy, and tracing the original grid lines established decades ago. Lines that my father's military-grade survey map matched down to the millimeter. I followed him at a respectful distance, documenting his process quietly, while Karen paced nervously around the fence she had illegally extended into my yard, her earlier bravado fading with every beep of the measuring device. The HOA president kept hovering beside the inspector, pointing at the ground with exaggerated authority as though he owned the dirt itself, but the inspector maintained a stoic neutrality that made their attempts at persuasion seem almost desperate. The longer he worked, the more I could sense a tension building, like a storm, ready to burst, because every measurement, every angle, every verification made it increasingly obvious that the fence was in the wrong place by a wide margin. As the inspector reached the midpoint of the yard, his equipment triangulated the official boundary and cast a bright digital line on his tablet that clearly diverged from the fence by nearly 12 feet. Though he remained professional and expressionless, the pause he took while comparing the readings told me everything I needed to know. The facts were aligning perfectly with the evidence I had provided. Meanwhile, Karen's anxious fidgeting grew more frantic, her breathing heavy and shallow as she tried to inch closer to see the results on the inspector's screen, only to be subtly blocked by his calm repositioning. The HOA board members whispered among themselves, exchanging worried glances as though silently negotiating who would absorb the blame when their false claims inevitably collapsed. The inspector continued his sweep along the length of the fence, and the numbers remained consistent, clear, precise, impossible to misinterpret. My father's map, drawn meticulously with the kind of accuracy only a military engineer could achieve, had proven itself yet again. I could almost feel his presence in that moment, a quiet validation that all the frustrations, stress, and mental strain of the past weeks had not been in vain. Once the inspector finished mapping the entire boundary, he walked back to the starting point, remeasured the primary anchor markers, and confirmed the coordinates matched the county's original land registry. Karen stood stiffly near her stolen section of lawn, clutching her arms tightly across her chest, her face paling as though each confirmation struck her like a blow. The inspector did not announce his findings, but he didn't need to. The clarity of the data displayed on his tablet created a silence heavier than any accusation. He simply stepped away to input data into his system, leaving Karen and the HOA in an uneasy stillness that exposed the cracks in their confidence. I remained quiet as well, understanding that the truth didn't need theatrics or confrontation. It only needed to be seen. After entering his notes, the inspector walked along the fence once more, this time photographing the misaligned structure from multiple angles, documenting the encroachment with clinical precision. Karen's breathing turned frantic, and she began gesturing wildly toward the ground, the air, the property markers anywhere except the tablet that displayed the irrefutable truth. The HOA president tried one last tactic, pointing to an old, rotted wooden stake in the ground as his supposed evidence. But the inspector didn't even acknowledge it. Instead, he traced where the actual stake should have been, according to the county records, and marked it physically, placing a bright flag exactly where the real property line stood. The distance between his flagged line and Karen's fence was vast, unmistakable, humiliating. I watched the HOA members' expressions crumble under the weight of factual precision. Their plan, built on manipulation and blind confidence, had collided with something they couldn't argue against: the law. And the law was not on their side. But even though relief coursed through me, I also braced myself, because I knew people like Karen rarely accept defeat quietly. True to form, she began pacing back and forth, visibly trembling, as though trying to conjure excuses from thin air. The inspector, finished with his fieldwork, simply said he would file a full report with the county, the HOA, and state compliance authorities. Again, he offered no opinions, no interpretations, just professional certainty. Then he stepped into his vehicle, leaving an echoing silence as the engine faded down the street. The moment he was gone, the neighborhood felt as though a bomb of tension had detonated without noise. Karen stood frozen beside the fence, her eyes darting wildly, her mind clearly scrambling for the next move in a game she was losing. The HOA members huddled together like soldiers trying to regroup after an unexpected ambush, their earlier confidence entirely erased. I knew they were not just facing embarrassment, they were facing legal repercussions, fines, possible suspension, and perhaps even dissolution of the board if misconduct was proven. And as they retreated to Karen's porch, whispering in increasingly frantic tones, I realized something critical. The inspector's report would not simply set the boundary straight. It would be the catalyst that cracked open everything Karen and the HOA had built on manipulation. But I also understood that people driven by ego, entitlement, and imagined authority often lash out hardest when cornered. If the fence had been their opening move, and the fabricated violations had been their escalation, then whatever they planned next would likely be reckless, fueled by desperation, and more dangerous than anything they had attempted so far. And as I stood alone in the yard, the flagged true property line glowing in the sunlight like a reclaimed victory, I felt both the triumph of truth and the looming certainty that the war was far from over, setting the stage for the explosive retaliation that would define the next chapter. The days leading up to the release of the official report felt like living inside a tightening coil, each hour drawing the tension closer to its inevitable breaking point. And although the neighborhood looked outwardly calm, lawns trimmed, cars parked neatly, families going about their routines, anyone paying attention could feel the subtle tremors of unease spreading beneath the surface. For me, each sunrise brought a cautious anticipation, the sense that the chaos Karen and the HOA had spent weeks manufacturing was evolving into something more frantic, more unhinged, and far more dangerous. The inspector's visit had created a crack in their carefully constructed facade of authority, and instead of accepting the truth or preparing for accountability, they responded like cornered predators, pacing the edge of their crumbling power while plotting a desperate final stand. Karen, once arrogant and theatrically confident, now lurked around the neighborhood in jittery bursts of motion, her hair frazzled, her expressions wild with exhaustion, and her voice thinning into a strained, frantic muttering as she skulked behind hedges, examined property markers, and scribbled notes in a warped binder, overflowing with maps she had obviously drawn herself. She moved like someone haunted by the possibility of losing control of a world she believed she ruled, refusing to acknowledge that reality had never belonged to her in the first place. The HOA board members were fracturing around her. The vice president, once her loyal shadow, now avoided her entirely, retreating into the safety of his garage, where he tinkered with his old motorcycle just to escape the volatility brewing next door. The treasurer, overwhelmed by the growing accusations of mismanagement, resigned abruptly through an email that circulated among homeowners like a quiet shockwave, his vague reference to ethical discrepancies only fueling suspicion about what the board had done behind closed doors. Even the secretary who had defended Karen so fiercely during the fence dispute walked through the neighborhood with hunched shoulders and lowered eyes, as if the weight of the scandal pressed his spine down with every step. The unity that once empowered Karen's entitled crusades was dissolving faster than she could patch it. And though I felt vindicated watching their influence crumble, I also understood that desperate people often make the most irrational, explosive decisions. Small acts of retaliation began creeping across my property like tiny warnings. One morning, I found deep boot prints around the flagged markers left by the inspector, the soil freshly disturbed, as though someone had attempted to tug one of the flags out before abandoning the effort. Another day, my security cameras caught a shadowy figure lurking near the fence line at almost 3 a.m, pacing back and forth with restless agitation before disappearing down the street. My yard hose was slashed open, my garden bed was trampled, and someone dumped a thick layer of gravel onto the edge of my driveway, as if trying to obscure something beneath. None of these acts were bold enough to be directly confrontational, but each one carried the same signature: desperate, frantic sabotage executed by people whose grip on power was slipping through their fingers. It didn't take long before the harassment escalated further. I returned home one afternoon to find a poorly printed notice taped crookedly to my front door, claiming that I owed the HOA a $14,000 emergency land correction fee and demanding immediate payment to avoid property seizure procedures. The letter wasn't even printed on letterhead, the wording was riddled with spelling errors, and the signature at the bottom resembled a trembling scrawl, clear evidence of forgery. It would have been laughable if it weren't such a blatant attempt at intimidation. But the most disturbing sign came when I discovered that Karen had begun rallying a small group of die-hard supporters, 3 homeowners notorious for gossip, pettiness, and blind loyalty, to conduct what she called boundary integrity walks. From my window, I watched them shuffle through the neighborhood in a disorganized cluster, clutching flashlights and clipboards, stopping at every property corner to poke at the ground or jot down nonsensical notes. They moved like a self-appointed militia, their paranoid movements and tense whispers turning every evening patrol into a performance of crumbling sanity. The more the state's official report loomed, the more frantically they tried to craft alternative reality, spreading rumors that the inspector had been bribed, claiming the county maps were outdated, insisting the satellite imagery was flawed, and circulating wild theories about how property lines were secretly redrawn during storms. Their desperation was both absurd and alarming, a sign that the approaching verdict was not just a legal defeat but a psychological unraveling for Karen and her followers. Every night, Karen's home became a frantic hub of chaos. Cars lined her driveway well past midnight, their headlights cutting through the darkness like anxious signals as her supporters shuffled inside with stacks of maps, rulers, notebooks, and documents they had clearly printed from questionable websites. Through my blinds, I could see them pacing, gesturing wildly, slamming their hands on tables, arguing silently through the glass. It looked less like an HOA meeting and more like the headquarters of a collapsing rebellion, the final, frantic hours before surrender. But Karen refused to surrender. She hurled herself deeper into delusion, convinced she could still control the outcome if she just found the right angle, the right lie, the right fabricated piece of evidence. She spent hours crouched beside her fence, measuring and remeasuring the boards with a warped tape measure, stopping only when frustration drove her into a frenzied storm of pacing. Her lawn became a chaotic battlefield of markers, strings, stakes, and mismatched flags, an erratic collage of denial attempting to overwrite a truth she couldn't escape. Still, the greatest shift came when I noticed the HOA president's vehicle parked outside the county building early one morning. He sat inside for nearly an hour before finally emerging with a stack of documents, his expression tight with dread. Whatever he had read confirmed what everyone already suspected. The official report was imminent, and it wouldn't be in their favor. Panic emanated from him like heat. 2 hours later, a hastily scheduled emergency HOA meeting notice appeared in everyone's email inbox, though the message was so rushed and sloppily formatted that it was clear the board no longer had the composure to maintain even basic professionalism. That evening, curiosity drew a crowd of homeowners to the HOA clubhouse, though most arrived only to witness the spectacle rather than participate. From where I stood near the back of the room, I could feel a shift in collective sentiment. People who once tolerated Karen's behavior now eyed her with growing unease, whispering to one another as her body jittered with restless energy. The president attempted to keep order, but his voice trembled, his hands shook, and his arguments collapsed under the scrutiny of residents who had been quietly collecting grievances for months. It didn't take long for the meeting to devolve into chaos. Accusations erupted, alliances shattered, and homeowners who had once obediently followed the board now demanded answers about financial discrepancies, falsified violation notices, and misuse of authority. Karen, unable to cope with the rising hostility, spiraled into incoherent rambling, waving her homemade maps like sacred texts and lashing out at anyone who questioned her. Her implosion was public, loud, and messy the moment everyone realized she had lost control long before the inspector ever arrived. The meeting ultimately collapsed without resolution, ending with board members storming out at different intervals, their unity shattered completely. And then, as if the universe timed it for maximum dramatic impact, The next morning, my mailbox held the envelope everyone feared, the official state compliance report, finalized and indisputable. But before I even finished reading the first page, I noticed another envelope tucked beneath it, one that would ignite the most shocking and chaotic confrontation the neighborhood had yet seen. A moment so explosive and irreversible that it would tear through the last threads of the HOA's crumbling power and set the tone for the dramatic unraveling to come in the next chapter. The eruption that followed the release of the state inspector's preliminary findings spread through the neighborhood like a wildfire that had been waiting for a single spark. And as the news circulated, residents who once passively accepted every HOA decision suddenly found themselves questioning everything they had ever signed, paid for, or complied with, causing a quiet but undeniable uprising that rattled the very foundations of the community's power structure, as Karen, the board president, and the rest of her inner circle scrambled desperately behind closed doors to spin the narrative in their favor, insisting that the inspector had misunderstood the documents, that the residents were overreacting, and that everything was still under review. But their frantic attempts to regain control were undermined by the fact that the inspector had left a thick packet of temporary orders with explicit instructions that all HOA activities were to be frozen, all enforcement suspended, all pending fines and citations voided until further notice, and the board was effectively stripped of authority, rendering Karen powerless for the first time in years. Yet, despite this, she refused to accept the loss. And instead of laying low or showing even a hint of humility, she doubled down, storming from house to house, demanding signatures for a petition to challenge the inspector's involvement, claiming that state oversight was government overreach, and insisting that she was being persecuted by a neighbor, me, who had weaponized paperwork to destroy the community she believed she had built. But her efforts only made her look more unhinged, as residents who once feared her now closed their doors, turned off porch lights, or pretended not to hear the doorbell, unwilling to be drawn into her last-ditch crusade. At the same time, the inspector continued their deep dive into every financial, legal, and procedural record the HOA had touched over the past decade, and revelations poured out like cracks forming in a dam. Thousands in unaccounted miscellaneous fees, contracts awarded to companies owned by board members' relatives, rules selectively enforced to punish neighbors who questioned decisions, and a shocking pattern of manipulated votes in which some homeowners' ballots had been lost, replaced, or never recorded at all. And these findings spread through the neighborhood in whispers at first, then conversations, then full-blown outrage, as people realized they had been living under a regime disguised as community governance. Meanwhile, my own life became strangely busy, as residents I barely knew approached me to thank me, ask questions, or share stories of their own mistreatment, and while some of them had long suspected that something was wrong, many had simply been too afraid or exhausted to challenge the board until now. But with the inspector's presence and the collapse of Karen's authority, people found their courage, forming small groups that met in living rooms and over backyard fences to compare notes, discuss next steps, and imagine what a fair community could look like. For Karen, this rising unity was a nightmare, and her behavior grew increasingly erratic as she attempted every tactic she could think of to regain control. She sent emails dripping with false authority, demanding residents stay calm and follow HOA instructions. Even though the HOA legally could not issue instructions, she tried to distribute new violation notices under the cover of early morning hours, but residents simply tore them up. She attempted to rally her loyal board members, only to find that half of them were suddenly unavailable or trying to distance themselves from her, and one even resigned outright with a public statement claiming they had been misled by Karen for years. Still, she refused to acknowledge defeat, and her fixation on me reached new heights as she began insisting loudly that everything happening was part of an elaborate plot orchestrated by me and my military connections, spinning stories about how my father's career, my survey maps, and my complaint to the state were part of some shadowy operation designed to dismantle her authority. And while her accusations were ridiculous, they revealed a deep desperation that made her both unpredictable and slightly dangerous, especially as she began trespassing through the neighborhood, collecting photos, notes, and supposed evidence to prove she was the victim of a conspiracy. The inspector, meanwhile, remained calm and methodical, continuing their investigation with an almost surgical precision, and each day brought new developments that further solidified the case against the HOA, including a set of emails discovered on a backup server showing that Karen had explicitly directed the board to support the fence expansion narrative regardless of evidence, instructing them to shut down any homeowner who questioned the boundary. And the inspector's face when reading that email in front of me was a mixture of quiet disbelief and professional resolve that told me the situation was about to escalate even more. By the third week of investigation, the inspector announced that they would be holding a mandatory community meeting at the clubhouse to present preliminary findings, and the announcement sent a shockwave through the neighborhood as residents prepared for what many believed would be the downfall of the entire HOA leadership. And Karen, realizing what was coming, attempted one final desperate tactic. She tried to cancel the meeting. She marched to the clubhouse with a handwritten sign claiming the building was temporarily closed, only to have the inspector remove the sign, tape an official notice over it, and warn her that obstructing a state investigation was a criminal offense, a warning that left her pale and trembling, though still defiant. When the evening of the meeting arrived, the clubhouse was overflowing as homeowners filled every chair, lined the walls, and even stood outside with the doors propped open, all of them buzzing with anticipation, anger, and relief as the inspector stepped forward with a thick binder and a projector, ready to reveal the truth. Karen attempted to sit at the front as if she were still presiding over the meeting, but residents quietly blocked the seat, forcing her to sit near the back, where she fidgeted and glared at me with a venom that suggested she still saw herself as the injured party. The inspector began presenting the findings in measured, factual tones, revealing inconsistencies in financial records, evidence of vote manipulation, illegal enforcement practices, and clear documentation showing that the property line had been moved without permission and falsely defended by the HOA. And as each point appeared on the screen, gasps, murmurs, and stunned whispers rippled through the crowd as people realized just how deep the misconduct ran. By the time the inspector reached the section on the fence dispute, every eye in the room shifted toward Karen, whose expression flickered between denial, fury, and fear, as the inspector calmly explained how the military-grade survey maps had provided conclusive proof not only of the true boundary, but of deliberate boundary manipulation. And when the inspector displayed the email, in which Karen ordered the board to support her narrative regardless of evidence, the entire room erupted in shocked outrage as residents turned toward her with a collective anger that had been building for years. Karen stood, shouting over the crowd that it was all a lie, part of a smear campaign, that the inspector was biased, that I had corrupted the process. But her voice was drowned out by the rising tide of homeowners demanding accountability, calling for her removal, and insisting that she face consequences for everything she had done. And in the chaos, she tried to push her way to the front of the room, only to be gently blocked by residents who no longer feared her authority. The inspector intervened, restoring order long enough to announce that a vote would be held the following week to formally dissolve the current board pending full investigation results. And that until then, the HOA would remain under state supervision, a declaration that sent a wave of relief through the room as people realized they were finally free from the oppressive reign that had controlled their lives for years. As the meeting ended and residents poured into the night air, discussing what would come next, I watched Karen slip out the side door, her shoulders hunched and her steps frantic, disappearing into the shadows like someone fleeing a crumbling empire. And although the war was not over and there were still chapters left to unfold, it was clear that everything had shifted and the balance of power had swung permanently away from the person who once believed she owned the entire neighborhood. And as the crowd dispersed, energized and united in a way I had never seen before, I realized that the final confrontation was inevitable, and the fallout from this night would determine the ultimate fate of both the HOA and the woman who had ruled it for far too long. The final chapter of the saga began with a palpable tension that hung over the neighborhood like a storm, about to break, as if every house, tree, and streetlight could sense the magnitude of what was about to unfold, and the air itself felt charged with anticipation, because months of manipulation, harassment, and deceit were finally converging toward a moment of reckoning that no one, not even Karen, could escape. The official state report had been filed, the board stripped of authority, and the HOA temporarily placed under supervision. Yet Karen's mind, untethered from reality by months of entitlement and desperation, refused to accept defeat, and she moved through the neighborhood in a whirlwind of frantic energy, issuing last-ditch commands to anyone who would listen, scribbling illegible notes on scraps of paper, waving outdated maps like talismans, and shouting accusations at imaginary conspirators. Her voice echoing down streets that once trembled at her presence, but now responded with silence, refusal, and judgment. And in that silence, the weight of her miscalculations became brutally clear, because the residents who had once cowered, complied, or ignored her were now awake, unified, and ready to see justice done. The culmination of her schemes reached its apex when the state scheduled an official public hearing to present the findings, including proof of her fence encroachment, falsified HOA records, financial misconduct, and instructions that all board members, including her, were to step aside pending further investigation. And the anticipation of that event rippled through the community, drawing homeowners from every corner to witness what would likely be the collapse of the HOA leadership. And while some approached with cautious optimism, others came with a simmering anger born from years of intimidation and harassment, eager to finally see the scales of fairness balance in their favor. Karen, however, seemed oblivious to the gravity of the situation, consumed entirely by her own narrative of persecution and conspiracy, believing that sheer force of will could overturn objective evidence, that shouting, pointing, and gathering her loyal but increasingly hesitant supporters could rewrite reality. And in her mind, the maps, the flags, and the inspector's measurements were nothing more than inconvenient obstacles in a story she insisted was her own, a story in which she remained the righteous defender of the neighborhood against imagined enemies. And yet her delusion only made her more vulnerable, because while she raged, the residents could finally see her clearly, not as a figure of authority or respect, but as someone who had been revealed as reckless, manipulative, and unfit to lead. The morning of the hearing, the streets surrounding the community center filled with cars, people whispering in clusters, scanning for familiar faces, speculating about what would be revealed, and waiting for the moment when the truth would be undeniable, irreversible, and public. And as I walked toward the venue, carrying the compiled evidence I had meticulously documented for months, I could feel a sense of finality in the air, a rare and powerful feeling that comes from seeing justice not as an abstract idea, but as an event about to unfold. The building itself seemed charged with the collective energy of everyone inside, every seat filled, every eye focused on the front, where Karen and the remaining board members sat nervously, papers shuffled in futile attempts at preparation, while the state inspector methodically set up a projector, laid out maps, spreadsheets, photographs, and digital records, and began the presentation with the calm authority of someone who understood the magnitude of exposing misconduct built over years of entitlement, manipulation, and deception. And as each piece of evidence appeared on the screen, murmurs turned to gasps, disbelief to shock, and the room shifted from polite attentiveness to a tense, almost electric expectation, because every fact, every timestamp, every photograph confirmed what the residents had suspected but could never prove: that the HOA had consistently acted against the interest of the community, and that Karen had orchestrated a series of deliberate, audacious, and illegal maneuvers to seize control, rewrite property boundaries, and intimidate anyone who challenged her authority. As the inspector moved through the report, Karen's composure faltered visibly, her hands trembling, her face pale, and her eyes darting desperately to the crowd, searching for an ally who could save her from exposure. But none came. The homeowners sat as witnesses, many holding evidence of their own grievances, others simply observing as the layers of deception peeled back in front of them, exposing the full extent of the damage inflicted on their trust, finances, and peace of mind. And when the part detailing the boundary encroachment appeared, the 12 feet of stolen property, clearly marked on survey maps and corroborated by my father's military-grade documentation, the room erupted in audible gasps and murmurs of disbelief, because even the least involved neighbors could now comprehend the audacity of the theft, and the clarity of the facts left no room for argument. Karen's attempts to interrupt, shout, or deflect were instantly drowned out by the collective attention of the community, the inspector maintaining control with a quiet authority that made it impossible for her to hijack the narrative, and every attempt she made to claim bias or fraud was met with questions from the audience, challenging her statements, demanding proof she could not provide, exposing the emptiness of her assertions in real time, and revealing just how isolated she had become. The report also revealed the financial misconduct. hundreds of unauthorized charges, misallocated funds, contracts awarded to relatives of board members, and falsified meeting minutes, each page more damning than the last, leaving the remaining board members in stunned silence, some shaking their heads, others sinking into chairs, and a few even quietly slipping out the back door, unwilling to face the community they had misled, while Karen's reaction escalated from frantic gestures to near panic, stomping her feet, waving papers, trying to shout over the crowd, but the weight of undeniable evidence crushed her efforts like a tidal wave. Homeowners began voicing outrage, their collective voice filling the room, demanding resignations, restitution, and immediate compliance with state directives. And the inspector, calm and unwavering, detailed every corrective action that would follow: dissolution of the current board, oversight of all HOA operations, restoration of illegally collected funds, and confirmation that the property line would be returned to its rightful position with legal enforcement. For Karen, the humiliation was complete. The combination of public exposure, legal authority, and communal judgment rendered her powerless, her previous control evaporating in real time, and, as the final slides of evidence were projected, showing before and after comparisons of the property line, copies of forged violation notices, and internal emails exposing her orchestration of the boundary manipulation, the room seemed to collectively exhale, a cathartic release of tension that had been building for months, years even, and the transformation was immediate. Neighbors who had once been hesitant, fearful, or silent now stood, some applauding, some shaking their heads in disbelief, some documenting the moment to ensure it could never be denied later. And in that shared awareness, a profound shift occurred, because the HOA's abuse had been made visible, undeniable, and subject to collective witness, ensuring that the community could never again be held hostage by the whims of one entitled individual. Karen finally slumped into her chair, exhausted, trembling, defeated, the last vestiges of her authority gone, as the inspector closed the binder, summarized the next steps, and officially declared the current board's suspension and the state's oversight until full compliance could be achieved. And in that moment, the neighborhood collectively understood that this was more than just a property dispute or a fence issue. It was the culmination of months of harassment, deception, and entitlement being confronted and corrected in a way that left no room for ambiguity, setting a precedent for fairness, accountability, and the power of evidence, preparation, and persistence over ego, manipulation, and fear. As people filed out of the building, many stopped to shake my hand, offer words of gratitude, or simply smile with relief, while others gathered to discuss plans for rebuilding the HOA in a way that served the community instead of controlling it. And as the sun set over the neighborhood, casting long shadows across the reclaimed property line, I finally allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction, knowing that the battle had been long, exhausting, and emotionally taxing, but that justice, patience, and meticulous documentation had prevailed over entitlement, arrogance, and deception. And while the work of rebuilding trust and community would take months, even years, the ultimate victory was undeniable, permanent, and absolute. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the neighborhood felt free from the tyranny of Karen and her corrupted HOA, a freedom that would be remembered as a turning point for generations to come, marking the end of the saga and the restoration of order, fairness, and rightful authority.